if we were speaking about leisure time, if we were to take a metaphor from our school days, we'd say that in coming here, we're attending an extracurricular event rather than a required course. It's optional. But I'd say that I think for me, this has been the case, and hopefully for a lot of us, that something happens in encountering this kind of material that we're going over, perhaps tonight's material in particular. That is that the ground starts to shift under your feet a little bit. The space that this event occupies loses maybe its merely elective categorization, and you realize that you're called upon in a manner distinct from the demands made on you during your other leisure time. So what you hear through our presenters is a message that calls for your care, for your attention, and just maybe your relay. The message asks that you give it life after tonight. And this has to do with the nature of Catholic social teaching, which invariably interprets the present arrangement of our world, its structures, its crises and concerns, its hopes and efforts made towards change in the light of God. That is God's law, God's scriptures, God's revelation, his will for the world. And this orientation of Catholic social teaching carries it right up to the edge of the domain of prophecy. So for the prophet in ancient Israel, the prophet is a person who interprets, with refreshing and amazing stubbornness, the situation of God's people in light of God's will. The prophet does not step away from proclaiming his or her insight into dysfunction and injustice, into corruption and disobedience before the Lord, and he speaks these judgments irrespective of the powers in his or her midst. So it's this same species of stubborn truthfulness, this fidelity to the interpretation of the specifics of our created reality in light of the Creator, that gives Catholic social teaching what we might call its prophetic signature. And so as we proceed, I want to say that inasmuch as we detect maybe a change in the atmosphere, what we are feeling is the prophetic pull, the call to a deeper awareness, the pressure to fresh evaluation, and the yank out perhaps from our regular seats. And at least that has been the impact for me that I've experienced in going through the Church's social teaching. And most especially, this was my experience when I first read Pope Francis's 2015 social and ecological encyclical Laudato Si. And this encyclical, which I believe Dr. Miller will speak about tonight, and even if he doesn't, he'll be touching the same territory. The encyclical calls for nothing less than a new way of beholding our world. It summons us to an awareness of our interdependence with all being, and accordingly faults us for too often embracing a logic of domination and exploitation towards the non-human, as well as carrying the same logic out towards other human beings. So it sees our treatment of the earth and our treatment of one another, Laudato Si does, as two sides of the same coin, and draws into relationship with this core issue of our care for the environment the following: the status quo of the marketplace, the habits of our consumption, the exploitation of the poor, and the treatment of the unborn. The encyclical challenges us to enter into mutual relationship with the whole living world, and challenges us to love the creation that sounds forth the Creator, to esteem creation as a precious finite expression of God's infinite love. So what I want to say is that when I read Laudato Si for the first time, getting back to this point about prophecy, I would say the document spoke to me as a prophet would, saying to me, as much as you look, but you do not see. So the document would disclose to me, you listen, but don't understand. You look out at the mountains and the lakes, at the great web of life of which you're a part, but you do not apprehend your relationship to the whole closely enough. You hear the birds sing, but you don't understand that they call out to you as siblings. And so for me, the ground began to shift under my feet, which has been good for me. And my default relationship with creation has been tested, and in the process of being tested has been broadened. So carrying that out to our group, I would say that my only exhortation as we start tonight is that if you also begin to feel the earth move some beneath you to go ahead and let it give way, because it can only be more solid ground that ends up taking its place. So addressing us tonight on the theme of care for God's creation is Dr. Vincent Miller. He is a Gudorf Chair in Catholic Theology and Culture at the University of Dayton. He has taught and written extensively on theology and ecology, including in his work as editor of and contributor to the book, The Theological and Ecological Vision of Laudato Si. Dr. Miller also studies the relationship between culture and religious practice, that is the way the world we shape shapes us. And lastly, I should add that he knows in a particular way our Oregon ecosystem. He's studied old growth forests out on the coast. And even when I connected with him, he was on his way to Oregon to conduct research here on the theological virtue of hope in the wake of the wildfires. So we welcome, in this case, back to Oregon, back in a certain sense, that is to say, Dr. Vincent Miller.
Well, thank you, Michael. And I want to thank all of you for the invitation. It's good to be with you, if only through Zoom. So this is better for the environment to address you this way, but it's also somewhat alienating. So I hope that I come through. I ask you, as I'm talking, if anything goes wrong, please make some gesture on the screen so I can know, because it feels very one way. I don't have any feedback from the people I'm addressing when I'm on Zoom. So I can see you up there on the screen. So if something goes wrong, or if I'm speaking too fast or something like that, just do gesture and I will try to respond. So Michael invited me to speak tonight in your series on Catholic social teaching, to speak specifically about Laudato Si. So what I'd like to do tonight is discuss Pope Francis's encyclical as a specific development of Catholic social doctrine. I'm going to begin with a discussion of the tradition of Catholic social thought and papal social teaching, then introduce some of the key themes from that tradition that are relevant to Laudato Si. Then I will devote the bulk of my talk to discussing its key concept, the key concept in Laudato Si, which is integral ecology. And this fits very well with what Michael was saying about ways of perceiving, looking but not seeing, opening our eyes, opening our ears. It's very much about perception, and I'm going to emphasize that quite a bit. And then I'll conclude by applying Laudato Si to some of the work that Michael mentioned that I've done in Oregon at the H.J. Andrews Experimental Forest. That's part of the Willamette National Forest, near where the town of Blue River used to be. Unfortunately, that town was incinerated in the fires last Labor Day. The old growth stands that I described survived the fires. They were just outside of where the wind roared. They were affected, however. And as Michael said, I'm currently working on a project about hope and seeing in light of those fires like that. But that work's far from finished, and we'll have time at the end if you have any questions about it. I'd be happy to discuss some of that later. So the major parts are Catholic social thought, just a general overview of how I understand it. 3 elements of the Catholic social teaching that are relevant to understanding Laudato Si, and then Laudato Si as a development of that. All right, so Catholic social thought. Just quickly, it has 2 major sources that I think are worth keeping in mind. First is the primordial and constant efforts of the church to live a communion that's adequate to the salvation offered in the preaching, death, and resurrection of Jesus. So the church is inherently social. It's a form of being social, and the church is always struggling to live up to the fullness of communion to which it's called, which is given as a gift, to receive that gift of the Trinitarian communion and live that out in our lives. The second major aspect of what we call Catholic social teaching or Catholic social doctrine is the distinctly modern reckoning with the end of the medieval social order. Much of the Catholic Church's early response to this was reactionary refusal, and that's somewhat understandable in face of the French Revolution and what it did. But gradually over the course of the 18th and 19th centuries, the church began to respond creatively on both the pastoral and theological fronts to this changed situation. So it moved from wishing, wanting, demanding that the monarchy be reestablished and the church be reestablished as an establishment religion, to beginning to engage aspects of modernity creatively. These creative experiments eventually found expression in papal social encyclicals, which in the earliest period wrestled mightily with both laissez-faire capitalism and Marxist socialism. Papal social teaching became a tradition when Pius XI commemorated Leo XIII's Rerum Novarum. Rerum Novarum, as you may know, was written in 1891, and Pius XI revisited the social question, as he called it, in the very changed circumstances of 1931 in an encyclical called Quadragesimo Anno, 40 years returning to these issues. Pius was writing amidst the crises of free market capitalism and the Great Depression, the Stalinist turn of Marxism, and the rise of fascism. So if you go back to 1931 and look around, there were really no good options. My dog checks on me, so that door will open several times as I speak. Sorry. There were no good options. Subsequent popes have returned to engage and critique economic and social questions on the major anniversaries of Rerum Novarum, and a later encyclical by Paul VI, Popularum Progressio. So we have many of these anniversary documents that are revisiting these questions over and over again. And it becomes a tradition in that way, revisiting these themes, applying them in different contexts. Papal social teaching and the broader tradition of Catholic social thought is noteworthy for its ongoing explicit engagement with changing conditions. Pius XI spoke to this new need with his notion of social justice, the evaluation not simply of individual acts or even of laws, but of entire social systems. The church became aware of the fact that human society and economic structures and political structures change, and we need to be able to think about them on the whole. So this notion of social justice is a way of asking those big questions. More recently, Benedict XVI offered an illuminating description of the engaged character of the church's social doctrine in his encyclical Caritas in Veritate, which was a commemoration of Popularum Progressio. In his words, the church searches for truth, proclaims it tirelessly, and recognizes it wherever it's manifested. Open to the truth from whichever branch of knowledge it comes, the church's social doctrine receives it, assembles it into a unity, the fragments in which it is often found, and mediates it within the constantly changing life patterns of the society of peoples and nations. So what I want to introduce in that first part is this: the Catholic social teaching is always undertaken in this dialectical relationship with what's happening in the world. As structures change, new questions arise, and new critiques and new creative synthesis are necessary. All right, so that was a very quick introduction to how I'm thinking about Catholic social thought. I want to then quickly jump to the three aspects of this tradition, of the social doctrine tradition of the church, that are relevant to Laudato Si. And those are the common good, solidarity, and integral development. The common good is widely used, and it's a widely used and frequently misunderstood term. It's often equated with the average economic flourishing of members of society, but it's more than what everyone has on average. The compendium of the social doctrine of the church describes the common good, distinguishes the common good from the simple sum of the particular goods of each member of society. The compendium notes that this good, the common good, is common because it is indivisible, and because it only together is it possible to attain it. In David Hollenbach's words, the common good fulfills needs that individuals cannot fulfill on their own, and realizes values that can only be attained in our life together. It designates a certain kind of agency working together for the good of the whole. It concerns the flourishing of the entire community, something that increases rather than diminishes when it's shared. It is something to which we both contribute as individuals and participate in. So it's something we draw from, we participate in society and the goods that we accomplish together, and in turn we give back to it. The political common good, to tie this back to some theology, is of interest to the church because it's an incomplete but real fulfillment of the unity to which we are all called in Jesus Christ. The comparison with the unity of Jesus, the union of Jesus and the Father in the Gospel of John, calls attention to the character of our relationships. In the words of Gaudium et Spes, humans cannot fully find themselves except through the sincere gift of themselves to one another. Okay, so that's the common good. Solidarity has been described by Megan Clark as the virtue that corresponds to the common good. And Pope St. John Paul II offered an extended reflection on solidarity in his encyclical on social concern, or Solicitudo Rei Socialis, which was another commemoration of Paul VI's Popularum Progresso. Solidarity is the social dimension of love, the social dimension of charity. As a virtue, it describes the ability to see the social dimension of problems and the courage to stand together in community to confront injustice and build shared flourishing. As John Paul II said, solidarity is the firm and persevering determination to commit oneself to the common good. That is to say, to the good of all, and of each individual, because we are all really responsible for all. For John Paul II, solidarity was based on the underlying fact of human interdependence. We are not born self-sufficient individuals. We are born into families and communities, sheltered and nourished, educated and encouraged. A full human life involves accepting support from our communities and in turn, making our own contribution back. Note how this moral teaching presumes an underlying relational character of human existence. We'll see this structure replicated in Laudato Si. The third building block comes from Paul VI, who I've been referring to his encyclical Popularum Progresso repeatedly. This encyclical was on the progress of peoples, on human progress. And there's a notion of what he called integral development. This displays really well, since it's much more recent, how the church creatively and critically engages secular social thought. Paul aimed to both embrace and theologically frame the notion of development that was emerging as a model and ideal in the late 1960s. The term integral development, which if you actually read the encyclical, I'm sorry to say you won't find it in the English translation because they translated integral as well-rounded, not the best translation. Integral development accepts the importance of development for the church. As a sacramental and incarnational religion, the church sees the importance of basic human flourishing as the basis for our supernatural life of grace. Christian flourishing presumes basic human flourishing. But Paul VI locates the material goals of development within a framework of human transcendence. Humans need nutrition, healthcare, economic and political agency. But these all find their ultimate meaning in our shared supernatural destiny of communion in God. And so integral development was a way of connecting the church's eschatological vision of the end of human life up with these widespread discourses about how best to pursue human flourishing on earth, right? So bringing them together in this very Catholic way, saying, yes, this is true, but there is more. So with these three concepts briefly outlined, let me turn to Laudato Si. Laudato Si is Pope Francis's 2015 encyclical on the climate and the environmental crises we face. It's the most extensive statement by the magisterium concerning environmental ethics, but it builds upon significant statements by both Pope St. John Paul II and Benedict XVI. Laudato Si's major idea is integral ecology. And I want to talk about integral ecology on three levels. The technical terms are ontology, epistemology, and ethics. But the translation of those terms are integral ecology is an imagination, is a vision for the world as interconnected. It is a way of seeing, a way of perceiving the world that's attentive to those interconnections. And then finally, it's a way of valuing those interconnections. And it's really important to see those three different dimensions there because at least in my university or in my work with the media and the reception of Laudato Si, a lot of people were so glad that the church is taking a stand for environmental ethics and environmental justice, and now the Catholic Church will be on board for this, and everyone knows they should do this. They should care for creation. That's good as far as it goes, but it doesn't really go that far. the idea of integral ecology is much deeper. It links together, the fundamental spiritual and theological commitments of Catholicism with an understanding of the world as interconnected. It links together spirituality with a way of opening our eyes and being attentive to the world. And then finally, those things lead to a practice of actually valuing these interconnections we see in the world. So those three levels are necessary, and I'm going to talk about them in turn. So the first, integral ecology as an understanding of reality. In Francis's words, each creature is a caress of God. As a vision, integral ecology is an understanding of the interconnections among all things. In philosophical terms, it's an ontology describing the relational nature of reality. This understanding is based upon specific doctrines, beliefs, and scriptural themes that teach these interconnections. Francis traces them a lot to the Hebrew scriptures. The creation accounts, in his words, the creation accounts in the book of Genesis contain, in their own symbolic and narrative language, profound teachings about human existence and its historical reality. Human life is grounded in three fundamental, closely intertwined relationships: with God, with our neighbor, and with the earth itself. This vision is rooted in the doctrine of creation, that is, belief in God as the creator of all things, and that all created things thus have a role in the harmony of creation. Francis cites St. Thomas Aquinas' argument that the diversity of creatures expresses the infinite goodness of God, which could not be represented fittingly by any one creature. The diversity of creatures and their multiple relationships together conveys the goodness of the Creator. Thus, in Pope Francis's word, each creature has its own purpose. None is superfluous. The entire material universe speaks of God's love, his boundless affection for us. Soil, water, mountains, everything is, as it were, a caress of God. The ultimate foundation of this vision for the interrelatedness of all things is the triune God who creates them. Paragraph 240 of Laudato Si, I think, really can be read as its spiritual core. Francis connects the three levels of integral ecology being discussed here with the relational character of the triune God. So I'll read through this. First, the divine persons are subsistent relations, and the world created according to the divine model is a web of relationships. Creatures tend towards God, and in turn, it is proper to every living being to tend towards other things, so that throughout the universe, we can find any number of constant and secretly interwoven relationships. This understanding, then, that all of creation reflects God's relationality gives rise to a way of perceiving the world that is attentive to those interconnections, right? If the world bears the mark of the triune God, then in faith, we look at the world trying to perceive those interconnections. So to quote Francis again, this leads us not only to marvel at the manifold connections existing among creatures, but also discover a key to our own fulfillment. We humans don't simply notice these interrelations in the world around us, we participate in them socially, as we talked about with the notion of the common good and solidarity, and for this encyclical, ecologically. We learn from the triune God and the created world that reflects that God that our fulfillment, and indeed our sanctification, is found not in isolation, but in embracing and deepening relationship through human solidarity and care for creation. So to return to Francis's words, the human person grows more, matures more, and is sanctified more to the extent that he or she enters into relationships, going out from themselves to live in communion with God, with others, and with all creatures. In this way, they make their own that Trinitarian dynamism which God imprinted in them when they were created. Everything is interconnected, and this invites us to develop a spirituality of that global solidarity which flows from the mystery of the Trinity. All of this resonates deeply with what we speak of in the Catholic intellectual tradition as the communal dimension of the human person. The Compendium of the Social Doctrine of the Church speaks of the constitutive social nature of human beings. And what we see in Laudato Si is this is being expanded into our relationship with all creation. If Pope Francis's understanding of interconnection is rooted in the Trinity and trusts in the power of the Holy Spirit to bring all things into communion, he understands this vision to be accessible and available to people of any faith or of none at all. following in the footsteps of Pope John the 23rd, who addressed his 1963 encyclical Pacem in Terris to all men and women of goodwill. Francis presents Laudato Si as a dialogue with all people about our common home. Catholicism does not separate faith and reason. Both describe the same universe. Honest openness to the world will find interconnection regardless of faith commitment or lack thereof. All right, so let me say a little bit more about integral ecology as a way of seeing. Francis describes this as of a piece with his spiritual and theological commitments. He speaks of an attitude of heart, which approaches life with serene attentiveness, which is capable of being fully present to someone. And he cites Jesus as the supreme example of this. In his words, Jesus taught us this attitude when he invited us to contemplate the lilies of the field and the birds of the air, or when seeing the rich young man and knowing his restlessness, he looked at him with love. Jesus was completely present to everyone and to everything. And in this way, he showed us the way to overcome that unhealthy anxiety, which makes us superficial, aggressive, and compulsive consumers. As you may know, the gaze of Jesus is very important to Pope Francis. The scene of Jesus' encounter with another rich young man, the calling of Matthew the tax collector, is the basis for his papal motto on the coat of arms, which is miserando atque eligendo. The phrase can be roughly translated as by having mercy and choosing him. Francis likes that the Latin word miserando is not easily translated into modern languages. It means by having mercy, but as Francis prefers to observe, literally it means mercying. Jesus's gaze is mercying. He looks upon people and things with love that sees the fullness of what they are and what they might be. There's always more to someone or something than meets the eye. In Matthew's case, the something more is that a wealthy tax collector might become a great apostle. In the case of integral ecology, it is the patient openness to imagine and to understand the many interconnections among the other creatures with whom we share this world. All things around us, soil, trees, bees, are so much more than simple objects that meet our eyes. They are interconnected in ways that have profound importance for our lives. Consider soil. We know that it's more than dirt, of course. It is where plants grow, but it is teeming with microscopic life, bacteria, fungi, microscopic animals, all essential for supporting plant life. In Aldo Leopold's analysis, it is the foundation of a fountain of energy that flows from the sun through plants and animals, which gives us life and is a community to which we give back through care, as well as our own death and decay. No soil, no humans. Curiously, the Hebrew name of the first human in the Bible, Adama, literally means being of the soil. Integral ecology inspires us to gaze with patient openness to learn these connections. This attentiveness to connection has value beyond ecological relationships. Pope Francis's model for integral ecology is St. Francis of Assisi, whose great prayer poem from the Canticle of the Sun provides the title for the encyclical. In his words, Francis helps us to see that an integral ecology calls for openness to categories which transcend the language of math and biology and take us to the heart of what it is to be human. St. Francis was open to all creation. He responded to it, quote, not with mere intellectual appreciation or economic calculus, but with love. Just as what happens when we fall in love with someone, whenever Francis would gaze at the sun, the moon, or the smallest of animals, he burst into song, drawing all other creatures into his praise. For St. Francis, each and every creature was a sister united to him by bonds of affection. That is why he felt called to care for all that exists. Francis argues there is more here than naive romanticism. Our attitudes of love and attentiveness affect what we see, and thus what we are able to value. This is the path of transformation worth noting. For Francis, awareness of our relationships is the path to moral transformation. Seeing can precipitate moral conversion. It's not simply a matter of our priorities following what we love. Rather, it is that love enables us to see more of reality. In his words, if we feel intimately united with all that exists, then sobriety and care will well up spontaneously. Integral ecology is a way of seeing that opens our eyes to the myriad creatures with whom we are interrelated. It helps us to understand our interdependence and thus to value the rest of creation. Francis talks significantly about how integral ecology can draw from science. He opens the chapter on integral ecology with a discussion of the science of ecology. Ecology studies the relationships between organisms and their environment. Francis expands this scientific insight from biological ecology to human society, noting that the existence of human society is as much a matter of relationship with other species as it is a matter of economic development. Francis believes that integral ecology can, in turn, contribute to science as well. He argues repeatedly that our current crises can only be solved if the full range of human wisdom is brought to bear. Faith has much to contribute to the scientific task, not least the loving and attentive gaze of integral ecology, to seek to know and love the depths of things and their complex relationships. Whereas religious fundamentalists too often provoke a conflict between faith and science, Catholicism seeks their mutual enriching harmony. Pope Francis views them as mutually enriching ways of seeking the truth. In that regard, he quotes at length from Lumen Fide, the encyclical that Benedict XVI began and he finished. They wrote together, quoting that document, "The gaze of science thus benefits from faith. Faith encourages the scientist to remain constantly open to reality and all its inexhaustible riches. Faith awakens the critical sense by preventing research from being satisfied with its own formulae and helps it to realize that nature is always greater. By stimulating wonder before the profound mystery of creation, faith broadens the horizons of reason to shed greater light on the world, which discloses itself to scientific investigation." Then finally, we can say, we have integral ecology as this vision of the world is interconnected, arriving from the doctrines of creation and by the triune God. And then integral ecology is this way of seeing, as this way of perceiving the world. And then finally, it's a way of valuing the world. Laudato Si views the myriad creatures and their manifold relationships to which these ontological and epistemological perspectives encourage us to attend as good. These are good things. Humans should thus work to preserve, restore, and cultivate the interrelationships among our fellow creatures. And I hope you see here the difference now. With this imperative to attend to interconnection, there's more to do. It's not simply saying, well, you should care about creation and join whatever environmental movement there is and go with that. It's more than that. It's a curiosity about how the world works. The more you know what's going on, the more you love it, the more you attend to it, and then the more you can defend it and try to deepen and preserve those relationships. So those are the three levels of integral ecology. A way of imagining the world as constituted in interrelationships flowing from the triune God. A way of seeing, a spirituality of attending to those relationships, of being curious about them, struggling to see them. And then finally, a way of valuing, saying that they are good. Those interrelationships are good. So what I'd like to do with the remainder of my time is talk a little bit about the research I did at the H.J. Andrews Forest. And for this portion, I've worked with a photographer, David Paul Bales, who lives in Central Oregon. And as I talk about that forest, I'd like to share with you his photography. So let me bear with me as I try to make this change. Hopefully I can make this work. But what I'm gonna do is I'll show you these photographs because I can't seem to actually read my script while I display them. So I'll just take you through them and let you remember those. I apologize. So this is the H.J. Andrews Experimental Forest. It's part of the Willamette National Forest. It's just outside of Blue River, Mackenzie Bridge, Oregon, along the Mackenzie River Valley. So let me talk a little bit about an old growth forest. I apologize that I can't seem to actually read my text and show you that at the same time. So entering an old growth forest can be overwhelming. The sheer tangled abundance of life is shocking.
Just a quick reminder that you're still sharing your screen.
Okay, I'll stop that. You can see my text. Thank you so much. All right. All right. So massive trees, you know this, but centuries old, rise from heaps of moss and ferns and disappear into the canopy above. Life overlaps everywhere, leaving no surface bare. Some trees are so covered with moss, lichen, or fungus that it's difficult to see their bark or even needles. Curtains of damp moss hush sound. The scent of conifers and the earthy musk of soil fill the air. Underfoot, the ground is soft and deep. There are so many layers and every shade of green that it's difficult to take it all in. There are hints at a time scale beyond human reckoning. Moss grows very slowly, but here it covers just about everything. A tree bends towards an opening in the canopy that it filled centuries ago. Encountering this riot of life can be like walking into a loud party full of many conversations and more than a few fights, or arriving in the middle of the harmonies of dissonance of a complex symphony. It's tempting to focus on just one thing. So when I was there, I reached out, the first time I touched a tree, I reached out and I very carefully touched a part of the bark that was exposed instead of touching all the moss that was around it. And I realized that I was still not thinking right? The tree is not an individual. The moss growing on the tree is part of the community of that tree. This Douglas fir hosts thousands and thousands of other creatures, and its flourishing depends on thousands and thousands of other creatures. So that's a quick description of an old growth forest. You're from Oregon, you can do this better than I can. I'd like to talk a little bit about how we perceive that, right? So those words that I just gave you are my attempt to walk into that space and describe it. It was a sincerely attentive attempt to understand that forest, to see it, but I miss a lot. As you walk around the forest, right, there's things littering the ground, there are branches everywhere, there's things overlapping each other, and it's not easy to actually know what's going on. And what's interesting about the H.J. Andrew Forest is it's the place where all these different scientists were working together, geologists and hydrologists and forest ecologists and animal ecologists working together. And as they worked together, they began to fill in the interconnections among the various systems there. They began to think in an interdisciplinary way. And this is a place where two very important things happen. One, a lot of the research that was done to understand what old growth actually is. The word old growth as we use it today is dependent significantly upon the research they did there in the 70s. The definition of the characteristics of an old growth forest as a thing, as an active ecosystem. Prior to that, these were called decadent forests. The Forest Service would go in there, or forestry scientists would go in there, and they see all these rotted trees, and they'd see all these fallen down trees, and they say, what a horrible waste, right? This moss is covering everything. All these things are competing for each other, right? This is highly inefficient. And so prior to this research, the explicit goal of the Forest Service and of American forestry was to mow down decadent forests because they were full of disease and replace them with clean, orderly tree plantations with Douglas fir on a grid, right, to maximize that production. And here's a place where they looked closer and they began to understand that there's more going on than meets the eye. And so the science that was developed there really helps us with this gaze that integral ecology calls for. So the lichen that's spread around the ground, if you walk through old growth forest, you'll see that it looks kind of like, looks exactly to me like on one side what dragon skin would look like, although I've never seen a dragon. And the other side, it looks like Napa cabbage. That's Lobaria oregana. It's a lichen. It turns out that that's really crucial to the forest. It's all over the floor because it fixes nitrogen. In a dense forest like the western slope of the Cascades, after 100 years, the canopy closes, and there's no more nitrogen fixing undergrowth plants to provide for the growth of the trees. And if there's no nitrogen, those trees will quickly fade away, right? They can't continue growing for 500, 800 years like they do. Turns out that lobaria that's living in the canopy falling to the ground is how the forest fixes nitrogen. The moss covering those branches and trunks is often as old as the trees themselves, and it plays an important role in capturing nutrients from the air and slowing the flow of rainfall down the tree. If you've been around very old trees, Douglas fir or western hemlock or cedar, there's often those massive mounds at the base of the tree, right? That's there precisely because the moss has slowed that water down, and it doesn't wash away things. It collects all the things that are collected from the air at the base of the tree and feeds the tree. The rotting fungus and bugs that consume dead trees are not just disease, they're actually converting cellulose and lignin into soil nutrients that feed the astounding rise of these trees. One of the lessons from the Andrews is that rot is itself life, and there's more living tissue, bacteria, fungus, and bugs in a fallen tree than a living one. Now, none of this is obvious to a casual or even sincerely attentive observer. Much of it takes place outside the range of human sensation. Scientists struggle to broaden our scales of time and space in order to understand the hidden cycles of life. Learning the role of lichen required chemical analysis and finding a way to work in the canopy. Knowledge of the cycle of log decay comes from an ongoing decomposition study that will follow the progress of fallen trees through the entire 200 years that it takes for a log to become soil. This devotion to and commitment from multiple generations of scientists certainly justifies considering the scientific form of what, considering this science as a form of what Francis would call serene attentiveness. This work attending to the fullness of creation has revealed astounding complexity. As we walk through the forest, we notice plants and animals around us, but often we literally miss the forest interconnections for the trees. The greatest part of that biodiversity lies below the ground, where thousands of 16,000 or so different species of worms, arthropods, and insects live. Below the ground lives another complex web that facilitates one of the most astounding sets of relationships in the forest, mycorrhizal fungi. Mycorrhizal fungi live in symbiosis with living plants. Scientists have known these soil funguses are important for more than a century, but only in the past few decades have they found ways to study the complexity of their relationships. Using electron microscopes, they can see that the fungi actually penetrates and surrounds root hairs, and using actually then carbon-14 gases and tracing the radioactivity, Susan Simard famously found that the Douglas firs are in a symbiotic relationship through the fungus with birch trees in these forests. And in the spring, when the birches haven't leafed out yet, and the Douglas firs are producing a lot of sugar, the sugar is shared through the fungus to the birches to help them grow. And then in the summertime, when the birches are roaring with their leaves out, they have more than they can handle, and in turn, the fungus shifts that back to the Douglas fir. DNA analysis reveals that these networks can extend for hundreds of yards or even miles, linking the root systems of many trees, including different species, into a network that shares nutrients, water, and chemical alerts. One study found as many as 65 separate fungus species forming root networks in Douglas fir forests. So far from ruthless competition, we find diverse communities supporting their members in these complex ways. Vast, complex, multi-species networks thrive by sharing resources and information. The vocabulary used is as consonant with Catholic social thought as the reality describes. The technical term for these fungal networks is cooperative guilds. So there's something very similar to the common good in the forest. So we learned three things in the forest here. The first is something like confirmation of the vision of Laudato Si. Now, we want to be careful here and not say that science proves Catholic social teaching, but it certainly rhymes very well with it, right? This is not to gloss over the hard truths of evolution by forcing ecology to narrate a secular Eden. Predation and parasitism are as prevalent as symbiosis and mutualism, but the density of relationships is unmistakable. No individual plant or animal, and indeed no species is an island. Ecological niches aren't really patches of ground defended from competitors, but multi-dimensional relationships. Remove one part and the rest can falter. For thousands of years, humans have been cutting down the great temperate and tropical forests that once covered much of the earth, resulting in not just loss of trees, but in the destruction of massive complex ecosystems. The effects of deforestation can take years, decades, and even centuries to appear. On ecological timescales, the agriculture we replace them with often proves frightfully short-lived. In so many places, deserts now spread where forests once flourished. The narrow scope of what we value has remade the world. The impoverishment unfolds today in what scientists are calling the sixth mass extinction event. Human activity is eliminating species on a scale that ranks with the previous catastrophic die-offs that punctuate the geological record. We will bequeath this impoverishment to our own children and to the rest of the species forced to live on the planet we understood too little to share. Now, we don't just learn about the world around us, we learn about ourselves from these forests as well, that we are part of a creation that reflects the relational character of the triune God. So here I turn to our connection with the soil in the biblical record. So the invocation on Ash Wednesday, remember you are dust, and to dust you shall return, is quoting the book of Genesis, in which God fashions Adam from dust or clay. We generally read this as an expression of our nothingness without God's animating spirit. Yet some scripture scholars argue that the Hebrew here can and should be rendered soil. God creates and places us within a system of relationships. Our refusal harms them all. The statement made after Adam and Eve are expelled from the Garden of Eden, cursed is the soil because of you. So what if we prayed the more biblically accurate, remember you are soil, and to soil you shall return. Our bodies are not our own, separate from relationships, human and natural, but part of cycles that require we give back what we take, even our flesh. Take, this is my body, may resonate in places we seldom imagine. Our refusal to give is institutionalized perhaps in our modern death ritual of shutting our bodies off from the rest of creation in metal and concrete boxes, where indeed, rather than return to the soil, they decay into dust. The final lesson is perhaps the most challenging. In the forest, we learn how very difficult it is to be attentive. On a moral level, we must struggle with the objectifying gaze of what Francis calls the technocratic paradigm that sees the rest of creation as a mere object subjugated to the arbitrary human dominion. The Synod of the Amazon's proposed definition of ecological sin focuses precisely on ignoring and transgressing these interconnections. From the very few remaining fragments of old growth forests, one need not look far to find clear cuts and monoculture tree plantations, which manifest the devastation of such a sinful view of creation. The interplay of knowledge, imagination, and grace can let us encounter the astounding complexity of these forests more fully. Out of the interplay comes moments when awareness flickers, where each plant, each rock, and decaying leaf reverberates in its manifold interconnections. Green deepens into the viriditas that Hildegard of Bingen named the Spirit's work in creation. And we can occasionally catch a glimmer of the harmony that surrounds us. Now, full comprehension escapes us, as both complexity, the complexity of the world, and grace are beyond our grasp. But the more knowledge we have of particulars, the more our understanding of complexity grows, and with this, awareness of ever more dimensions that we do not comprehend. We need to incorporate such awareness of our limited perception into our everyday moral imagination. We act powerfully in the world, seldom knowing the full consequences of our actions. We have been doing so for millennia. The disappearance of large animals from ecosystems has been the hallmark of human activity since the Pleistocene. Humans are the great disruptors, hunting animals too large for any animal predator and reworking entire landscapes with agriculture and then with industry. Such ignorance is fundamental to the global market system, which works precisely by reducing the complexities of the ecological, social, and cultural costs of production to a price. So in conclusion, Our disruptions have now reached the planetary scale. Our future and the future of the countless species along for the ride with us in creation depend upon our cultivating a sense of our ignorance and a corresponding hesitance to act in haste. Will we keep our eyes closed in indifference or open them to the astounding complexity of creation and learn anew how to respond in love? Thank you.
Well, either way, we have to manage something here as we did last week. That is, we're gonna serve our dinner and then simultaneously start the Q&A. So before we begin, we're gonna go in the same order that we did last time. It's tempting to flip the script and start over here and give that group a chance, but it'll be so much more fluid if we start over there. So this table will go first to get their food after we say grace. But to begin with that, in the name of the Father, Son, the Holy Spirit, amen. Lord, we thank you and we praise you. We praise you tonight in particular for your creation and thinking about our meals, for the vast web of interconnected life that gives rise to this meal that we eat together, not least of all the human labor that went behind it. So we pray together, bless us, O Lord, and these thy gifts that we are about to receive from thy bounty through Christ our Lord. Amen. Okay, for our questions, we will begin with Tim Smith. Has let me know that he has a question, so here he comes. And same thing for those of you on Zoom, be ready to take the next question.
Yeah, thank you very much for the talk. It's kind of weird to ask a question when I can't, looking away from you. A question I had was, it seems like when we think about ecology as a system of relations, which is a really interesting way to think about it. I've really enjoyed the analogy between guilds and ecology. It's hard to see how humans can fit into this in a way that is positive and not as though we're sort of treated like we're an invasive species and we sort of begrudgingly admit that we can exist. So that's kind of my question, is how we can work from this to a more positive view of how humans can fit in.
That's a great question. Really a fundamental one. I suppose what I'd say is that theologically we have words for this, right? That humans are made to be a harmonious part of creation. We were made to till and keep the garden. These are very deep religious words in the Hebrew Bible. But the fall really shatters our relationship with the rest of the world, right? That's one of the three alienations of the fall. And so the stakes are very high, right? We are facing the fact that we are destroying the earth. And so there are, ecology can open our eyes to the relationships that we tend to ignore, and attentiveness to those relationships can be part of our conversion, right? So grace is there, elevating us, healing sin and elevating us to live a life in harmony with God's creation. And attentiveness to ecology is one way of seeing the stakes of that and seeing the complexity of that. I think those two things together, though, right? The notion of the fall is very important here because, yeah, in many ways we're going to seem like we're destructive interlopers and not having a role in creation. That's how deep the alienation is, right? There's a lot to overcome. This should not be surprising for Catholicism. But we don't believe that our created goodness is utterly destroyed. The intellect is darkened and the will is weakened. And through grace, we can see the truth and we can act in justice and love to the things around us. But yes, as you said, the stakes are enormously high, and it requires a radical rethinking of how we imagine ourselves in the world, and a radical change, in how we live in the world. I don't know if that speaks to your question adequately.
It does a bit. I mean, I think one of the reasons why I was asking this is it seems like our kind of, we have this view of the world, of all these system of relationships, and then almost like humans are this outside force and
Yeah.
everything we do is going to be bad. You see what I'm saying? Like, how can we actually be in the world and have it not be bad?
Yeah. There are ways to live in harmony with creation, right? By talking about agriculture as changing the land, we see that this is something very old. But there are ways there are mindful, attentive agricultural ways of cultivating these relationships, of caring for the land, of caring for the animals that we share the land with. Certainly there are resources in the remaining cultures on the earth that live hunter-gatherer lifestyles, or who live within forest ecosystems, right? Who've managed to live for thousands of years, in some cases tens of thousands of years, without destroying the world around them. They've changed it, but they haven't destroyed it the way we have. So these things are possible. I would say there's sort of two levels of this, right? We face this really imminent problem of carbon emissions and global warming and climate change, right? That requires some really fundamental reorientations of our energy systems, some fundamental reorientations of our systems of consumption. Those are sort of mid-course corrections, right? And we can actually make those. We don't have much time left to make those corrections, but it is possible within a decade or 2-decade time scale. And then there are just the more fundamental ongoing efforts to learn to live in harmony with the rest of creation. And that's something we're familiar with, right? In our own relationships, we don't ever get these things right in any given moment, right? It's a constant ongoing effort to build and deepen relationships, to attend to one another, in our intimate relationships, in our familial relationships, in our community relationships. That work is ongoing. And so, we have these big car wrecks, that we're about, these big train wrecks we're plowing into right now, which we need to turn away from. And then we have the long scale, relearning and attending to our role in the world. I think, one of the things that's necessary, and it's going to become a possibility, a shared social possibility in our lifetimes, is the emergence of what I like to think of as homo curans, humans as the healers, attending to these ecosystems, trying to strengthen them, trying to preserve them, trying to preserve endangered species, trying to keep these systems alive when they're threatened. We're going to have to learn how to move some of them because the climate is changing too fast for them to move themselves. So we will begin to involve, we have the possibility of involving ourselves in the active work of preserving and strengthening these systems. But yeah, conversion runs through all this, right? And that again is not something that's unfamiliar to us.
Thank you very much.
You're welcome.
Okay, onto the Zoom group, you can go ahead, and whoever would like to ask the next question can come up here and be ready for it. I have Kimball. Good. In Zoom, remember, you can just pop in.
Dr. Miller, this is Father Ignacio. Can you hear me?
Yes, hello.
I cannot be at St. Michael's because I'm here guiding a retreat for one of our deacons. Thank you for your presentation. I really appreciate it. This is more like a question out of curiosity, but sometimes opens. Basically, what led you to study both things, like the old growth forest and then Laudato Si? What triggered your interest in both themes, or in general in this theme of theology?
It's a great question. Thank you for that. I grew up in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, in the foothills of the Alleghenies. I grew up outside of the city and we're exurbs. And so my neighborhood was such that, the homes all faced the woods behind them. And the woods were always a place where I could go to escape the difficulties of life. Seeing, growing up and seeing the way in which those were being mowed down and being replaced by strip malls, seeing how these beautiful places were ceasing to exist, that was always there. I would say that a big influence as I was having those feelings and turning to the woods for solace was reading J.R.R. Tolkien's Lord of the Rings, in which forests play an enormously important role. Recently found out that he was influenced by some of the early research on mycorrhizal fungus as well. So if you remember Lady Galadriel's gift at the end to Sam, he has that little box of dust. There's some speculation that was based upon early mycorrhizal fungal research. But as you know, I suppose the other step theologically for me was my first book was on consumer culture. And the fundamental idea that I brought to that was this notion of commodification, that things appear to us as commodities, as shallow things. You walk through the grocery store, there are 10,000 things in the average grocery store. None of them tell you where they're from, right? The steaks are in the counter and they don't tell you about the slaughterhouse or the feedlot. The tomatoes are in the produce section. They don't tell you about the hands that picked them and what conditions they worked under, right? We just see the glistening surfaces. We don't see the depths. So I'm profoundly struck by the power of that economic system to separate us from what actually sustains us, right? Any meal is a relationship, right? I'm in relationship with the slaughterhouse workers and the vegetable pickers and and the farmers and the grain harvesters and the truckers. Like, all these relationships are here, but they're hidden from me. I see only the glistening tomato. So I became more and more concerned about the way we live in the world. Doesn't allow us, it militates against us realizing that our sacramental connections with reality. This notion that creation, that God is present in creation, and those relationships matter. And so when Laudato Si came along, I wanted to help in any way I could with that encyclical's reception and its the understanding in the world and in the church. And the Andrews Forest is a noteworthy place. After doing all this interdisciplinary research through the 70s to develop their understandings of old growth, starting these 200-year research projects, they had this idea of starting inviting humanities scholars and artists to come in and do long-term research as well. And so they were explicitly looking for philosophers, writers, theologians, religion scholars, artists to come in and reflect with them on what it would mean to attend to these things on these scales. So that invitation was really key to my being able to do this research. To be in a place where the story had already been told scientifically, so I could plug into that, right, without having to put all the pieces together myself. So it's a place of enormous. It's a place that really encourages relationships. It's a place that has a deep practice of hospitality and relationship. And so I've been drawn into that work that way.
Thank you. Just one comment, and you don't need to comment, but it's disconnected with your response. But I just finished studying C.S. Lewis and the notion of basically the Great Divorce and the book Miracles. Mm-hmm. And it's very interesting, his kind of an understanding of heaven is connection with reality. He has a very interesting theology of the new creation and heaven as a place of connection with the totality of reality, from relationships to, in some way, the glorified reality. We don't know how it's going to be, but so because you mentioned Tolkien, and so I don't know if you ever studied Lewis, but that's a very interesting point of connection with what you were saying of Laudato Si and the interconnection of beings in reality.
Oh, indeed. Yeah. Thank you for that.
I want to pick up on the Lord of the Rings. it was a profound disappointment to me when I watched the movie that there was no mention of Tom Bombadil.
Yeah.
I mean, we saw Sauron destroy the forest, and the Ents came back and the forest destroyed him. So clearly the relationship between man and nature is profound and important. But with Tom Bombadil, there's this interlude in a serene, natural community that Tom is in control of, and it's harmoniously existing, but evil is present. We see in the movie, we see the trees and the roots of the trees going around the hobbits to kill them. That actually is excerpted from Tom Bombadil. And so I guess the question or comment I'm thinking of is the issue, the question of man who was given dominion over the Garden of Eden, not destroying the Garden of Eden. I think we quickly all agree and understand that that's not in our interest. But the more profound and deeper question is man dealing with man. And it takes the self-sacrifice of the hobbits and the Fellowship of the Ring to take on Sauron and the ultimate dark evil. So is it enough to look at, we can learn from nature, we can learn from the interrelationship of man and nature and how we can better live among one another, but is it enough to focus on nature itself, other than as a step toward the almost greater problem of evil in our relationship with one another?
Yeah, thanks for that question.
I'll go back and sit.
Yeah, I'll say that Tom Bombadil was my least favorite part of Lord of the Rings as a child, and later on it became my most favorite part because Tom is the only person who doesn't play the game of power, right? There's that great line where they say, "Why don't we give the ring to Tom Bombadil?" And Gandalf says, "Well, maybe as Elrond says, he has no interest in such things, and he'd probably just lose it, right? He's completely outside of those games." Your question about where does the problem lie? I think you're right. I mean, the Hebrew account is that the problem with the world is human corruption, right? Is our failure to be obedient to this order and our attempt to usurp the role of God for ourselves, right? And that disobedience brings the brokenness of the world flows from that. Yeah. So ultimately, right, the answer to these questions is the salvation that God offers in Jesus Christ, right? That we are called into, we are brought back into communion with God, and through that gift of salvation, right, our relationships among each other, our social relationships are healed, and our relationship with creation is healed, right? All those alienations are healed in Jesus. So yeah, that's certainly ultimately the answer. Catholicism. What do we learn from looking at the rest of creation, looking at the natural sciences? Is we can see, as I said, we can see the enormous density of interconnection out there. Now we always interpret that in a certain way. So Darwin tried mightily not to make it to make natural selection, not simply be about the better triumphing over the weaker, but eventually got pulled into that notion of the survival of the strongest, not just the fittest. Fittest is something quite different, and that got drawn into what became social Darwinism, right? And then you have 150 years of imagination of nature as red in tooth and claw, right? That it's a violent place and it cares nothing for anything. I think we can see all sorts of things in creation if we attend to it. that help us see that frame on the world isn't quite true. That's not to say that predation goes away, right? There is conflict. There's predation. There are creatures eating other creatures. Everyone's eating someone else. Even if you're not eating other animals, you're eating other plants. But you see the way in which these relationships are so deeply attuned, right? Just take one example. Within Douglas fir needles, one of the problems that Douglas firs have, they live to be 500, 800, sometimes 1,000, 1,200 years old, right? So they've got their chemical defenses against insects, right? Well, insects reproduce, what, 2, 3, 4 times a season. So in the course of a life of a Douglas fir tree, there are thousands of generations of insects who will quickly out-evolve their protections, their chemical protections, their poisons against these bugs, right? So they basically, they can never win evolutionarily, the system. But living within each needle are various forms of algae that are not the same DNA as the Douglas fir. These are species that the Douglas fir hosts. They probably began as parasites. And they are constantly evolving as fast, or if not faster than the insects. And so they protect the Douglas fir from insect predation over the millennia that they can live. That's the evolutionary battleground is continually going on there. And so what I would point out there is it's not all hugs and kisses out there, right? It's not all partnerships. These things begin as parasitism, they begin as competition, and they begin to be drawn into these very, very complex relationships. And so we can learn a truth about ourselves out there, right? It's there is a value that we begin to, by looking closely with science at nature, to see the things we've forgotten about ourselves. We can see our own interconnections reflected there. And that's just a broader catechesis than we would otherwise have. So I think there's a real value to that. But I agree with you, that ultimately it's human sinfulness that has to be overcome and sanctified. And that is the ultimate answer to all these relationships.
Okay, so one more Zoom question, and we'll do one more here. If you're here and want to ask one, come up and talk to me. And Zoom, go ahead.
Yeah, I've got a question. Thank you for the talk and discussion points. Definitely enjoying it. You mentioned an idea that each animal is purpose placed in the world. And I think that's a very nice idea. I enjoy it, but animals and species in general have gone extinct before and would continue to do so independent of humans. It's undoubtable that we're seeing an increase right now, but it's not unprecedented in the long arc of history to see such rapid extinctions. And so how do we know what our role should be? Should we become vegans when we see the impact of large-scale meat productions, or can we simply be more aware of the trade-offs? Should we be changing plants and animals for what seems like the better, like genetically modifying food sources to be objectively better? I'm thinking of golden rice or neutering malaria delivering mosquitoes. Sort of, is this a good thing? Which is sort of summed up in the question of where do we look for guidance on the specifics of what actions we should or should not do? Is extinction actually bad, or is it just how we define that vision of what is included in the common good?
That's a great set of questions. All dimensions are profound. Let me try to get a stab at it. So one thing worth noting is that Laudato Si is quoting Thomas Aquinas there. And Aquinas, the key point that Laudato Si takes from Aquinas there is that it's in the manifold relationships of creation that the infinite goodness of God is better revealed. Right, so no creature in itself can reveal the fullness of God, but it's all the creatures as a whole in their many relationships, which is actually it's in the Summa. He has the relationship thing in there, which is just an amazing thing. That's where the nature of God is more fully revealed. So we need all these creatures. Each creature tells us something about God, and each extinction then is a decline. Creation says less about God with the extinction of each creature. So you can look at meditate on the video of that last thylacine in Australia, right? The last one of its species, alone. Or more recently, Tuffy, the Rab's fringe-limbed frog, who was the last of his species who died in Australia. Sorry, in Atlanta, in a zoo there. You can find him online and listen to his last call. Right? It's an announcement call. It's a mating call to no one. Right? There's no one to answer that, and so there's something lost in that harmony of creation that praises God and speaks of God with each creature that goes extinct. But that said, Aquinas doesn't know about extinction, right? That's not a concept that was available, in the medieval period. It doesn't develop till much, much later. Everything was seen to be, directly designed by God in some direct way there. We now know that extinction is part of how evolution works, right? Death and extinction are what would lead to new species. Now, extinction is not quite the same thing as death, right? So I mean, when the precursor species we came from went extinct, they didn't disappear and were replaced with these sort of new models that were shinier and better, right? They gradually became our precursors, right? They gradually became us. They don't just get wiped out, but sometimes lines do end. What do you do about, thinking about extinction today? I mean, the key thing I think is Aquinas's insight about those relationships still illuminates that the world flourishes more fully in all these manifest relationships, and every part that we take out of the web, out of the fabric of ecology, right, it becomes ever more fragile. You can see this, in the Douglas fir plantations around you, right? They look like forests, but if you go in there, there's not much going on, right? And when the fires come, they're on dry land. They all have the same canopy height. There's no dead wood in there, and there's not the humus level to keep the moisture in, and they just burn rapidly, right? So there's less life there. So as we erode those threads, the ecology itself degrades. We have a role. I don't have the answer on this, right? We have some kind of role that's different from other creatures in the broader scheme of relationships in creation. What does that role involve? Well, so far it's largely, for our entire existence, involved largely mindlessly taking what we want and not thinking about it. And recently we've gained the power to modify what's there, right, for certain ends, right? And I don't want to say that golden rice isn't helpful for some populations, right? It's not my problem. It'd be easy for me to say don't do that, right? I don't think we need to have the kinds of mass agriculture friendly things that we're doing with GMOs in this country, but in some places it might be necessary. Again, I'd be very hesitant to assume that we know the full good that we're pursuing with those acts, right? We have a record of very short-term thinking and not knowing what we're doing. But yeah, we do have some role to play in this ongoing play of species. But at this point, what we need most is to stop and learn the complexity of what we're facing, rather than assume we know how it works. That would be my incomplete answer to your great questions.
No, that makes sense, and it's certainly challenging. The one follow-up then is, on the flip side of that, should we be playing in a Jurassic Park world to find all of those species that had gone extinct for whatever reason and try to work to bring them back? And perhaps the challenging component is, if we don't know the bad that we can cause, we may not know the good, and vice versa. And so certainly the result or the recommendation could be, we just need to understand more, because in the past 50 years, 100 years, our understanding has dramatically changed of the impact that we have, and we should be very cautious in any changes that we make. But I don't know, besides we need more information, where to look for guidance in this.
Yeah, I mean, as far as the returning of species, species are on the verge right now, right? So the vaquita, there are less than 50 left, and this might be the last summer for them in the Gulf of California down there, right? These small dolphins, and this is happening all around the world. So there's desperately needed work to be done right now. And if we make it that long, we can begin to think about the mammoths and restoring those, the grasslands in Siberia. But right now, right, there's an emergency and species are dying, by the week. So, thank you.
Thank you.
Hi, I'm Robert.
Hi.
Seems like one of the burning questions tonight is, what is our relationship with nature and how can we live in harmony with it? And I came across a C.S. Lewis quote recently that was so relevant. I wanted to read it. It ties together that question and also the Lord of the Rings, so it's important. So the quote is from The Abolition of Man, and it is, there is something which unites magic and applied science, technology, while separating both from the wisdom of earlier ages. For the wise men of old, the cardinal problem had been how to conform the soul to reality, and the solution had been knowledge, self-discipline, and virtue. For magic and applied science alike, he thinks they're very similar, magic and applied science. The problem is how to subdue reality to the wishes of men. The solution is a technique. That's complicated, I'll read it one more time. For the wise men of old, the cardinal problem had been how to conform the soul to reality, and the solution had been knowledge, self-discipline, and virtue. For magic and applied science, the problem is how to subdue reality to the wishes of men. The solution is a technique. Peter Kraft, who I've been reading lately, calls this the single most illuminating 3 sentences I have ever read about our civilization. So I guess my question is, technology, do we need more of it or do we need less of it?
Another small question, yeah. What I would say is that technology is not one thing, and that there are codes and worldviews built into technology. And in the technology we currently have, right, it is this highly objectifying, reifying vision that you just quoted from C.S. Lewis there, right? That we refine things and we take them from the earth and we take them from natural systems and we use them towards our own ends. There could be a way of working more in harmony with those relationships that might still be technological in a different way. That said, I don't know what that is. It seems to me that one of the big limits on human sinfulness up to this point has been it's been the scope of our technical ability, right? As the technical ability is expanded, our ability to destroy the world is expanded. So yeah, but I don't think what we need right now is more technology. We do face some short-term, enormously pressing situations that will require some technical answers, right? So changing our energy system, we need different technology, even though that's still going to be along the same kind of extractive model, but we need to change that rapidly. So in that sense, we're going to need to do some technical things in the next 2 decades that are profound. But yeah, I think I agree completely with the quote from Lewis that you cited there, right? Ultimately, the question is, how do we not just tempest ourselves and not just self-knowledge, but knowledge of the world, right? And how do we find a way to more deeply align ourselves with that world? The question I would leave you with, and I didn't feel ready to share this work on the fires and hope yet, but you're in the middle of another heat wave, your second heat wave of the summer, right? Record-breaking temperatures, and so I would ask you, from this perspective of integral ecology and as a way of seeing, I would really encourage you to spiritually take seriously your experience of this. What is happening now? Your body's in it. What's that experience like? What can you learn there? With the fires last fall, may they not be repeated this fall, but we're drier now. The red flag warnings have already begun in Lane County. They began yesterday. Hopefully they're not repeated. But when you live in those fires, when you live in that smoke, what's actually happening there? I think as humans who are so involved in the production of this destruction, there's a spiritual need of attentiveness there. And I've been drawn lately to think about the Stabat Mater, the Mother of Sorrows, as a resource in our tradition for countenancing this suffering and destruction, like to really make attending to it a spiritual practice, which is not to say that, you know, it's an opportunity for spiritual growth that we should use, right? But we are in the gyre of this destruction, and spiritually, what is God calling us to? What can we learn from being in the midst of this? And so I want to leave you with that. I don't have the answer to that, but I encourage you to, you know, take these moments very seriously, to be open to these difficult truths, in addition to the more elevating truths of how ecosystems work. But I thank you very much for the invitation, and I thank you for your time tonight.
Yeah, thank you very much, both for the questions. And Daisy is gonna turn the camera around so you can see our thanks in a more embodied way.
Thank you.
All right, thank you so much, Dr. Miller, and
Thank you.
the rest of your night.
Good night, everyone.
Good night.